When you look at the New York City skyline, you might think of several things. The vision of the developers who put the deals together to make it happen, the ingenuity of the architects and engineers who helped realize that vision, and the courage and grit of the construction workers who helped build it. The New York City skyline has become a symbol of American enterprise globally, but it also represents something much darker. Studies show that real estate accounts for up to 2/3 of the city's carbon emissions. What can the real estate industry do to tackle the concept of climate change? And what more lies ahead? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by John Mandyck. He's the CEO of the Urban Green Council. It's a nonprofit that helps research and put together solutions for tackling climate change. So John, thank you for being with The Real Deal.
Thanks for having me on the program.
We started just by talking about the scale of the climate crisis and the scale of how, real estate's sort of culpability in it. How has real estate kind of gotten to the 21st century really without addressing this in a meaningful way?
I would argue that's no longer the case in New York City. We have a landmark law that passed that now places carbon caps on buildings. It will deliver the largest carbon reduction of any city in the world. Mm-hmm. New York is well on its way to addressing the issue. Now, I think you're pointing to a bigger issue, though, in how other cities and jurisdictions are looking at climate change. Mm-hmm. I've seen far too often the classic pie chart of a jurisdiction's carbon emissions. Uh-huh. And it'll say transportation, residential will have a slice, commercial will have a slice, industrial will have a slice, and then there's like waste. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, oh, transportation is our largest source. And so that's where we have to put our priorities. And I'll say, no, buildings are your largest source. And they'll look at their pie chart. They're like, what do you mean? I said, well, what do you think residential, commercial, and industrial are? Yeah. They're buildings, right? And so once you do that, there's an aha moment. And this has happened at the highest levels of government that I've been working with over my career, helping them kind of just reframe the data. And once you see where the data is, it becomes a lot more obvious about where you need to focus attention.
And so you mentioned a landmark piece of legislation. I'm assuming you're talking about Local Law 97, which really takes into account, it really kicks in for buildings of 25,000 square feet and greater. My concern with benchmarks like that, and I'd love to get your thoughts, is size is really an arbitrary way to measure carbon emissions, right? But is there any move towards really understanding this problem on an individual asset level?
You have to start somewhere. We have 1 million buildings in New York City. Mm-hmm. 1 million buildings. To cover 1 million buildings on day one, probably not going to work. So how do you start? And so our recommendation, which was passed in Local Law 97, is start at 25,000 square feet and above. Mm-hmm. With that delineation, the covered population goes from 1 million buildings to 50,000 buildings. Okay. Those 50,000 buildings represent about 60% of the floor area of the city. Mm-hmm. And about half of all the building emissions.
Real estate in New York, as you know, is a very dynastic business, right? There's these grand old families that own so much of the skyline, commercial and residential, because they are programmed to think long term. Is there a bigger sense of openness to the idea of transforming their buildings? Have you seen that sort of long-term thinking play out in any way, positive or negative?
I certainly have. In the family-owned real estate enterprises, especially because they think generationally. That's their business model. Yep. And they are within sight of the generation where New York City will not function because of climate change. New York Harbor is up 1 foot over the last century. Mm-hmm. Climate change and sea level rise is disproportionately higher in this part of the world. You layer on top of that New York has $3 trillion of insured coastal properties. I'll say that again, $3 trillion. That is twice the GDP of Canada. Mm-hmm. So that's what's at risk from an asset class standpoint. And you map that against New York Harbor and the waters around it that are up a full 12 inches over the last 100 years. And you can understand that this is a risk that needs to be managed.
One of the big opponents and still quite vocal about some of the challenges with the policy is the Real Estate Board of New York, which represents the kind of owners you're talking about. So it's not that harmonious, right? There is quite a bit of pushback from the industry. So what's that about?
We worked together with REBNY in the roll up, in the lead up to Local Law 97. Urban Green had convened a multi-stakeholder group to try to come up with consensus recommendations. What we ultimately together all recommended was an energy efficiency law to be the backbone of Local Law 97. The city and the city council decided it should be a carbon law. That was a major detour from what was expected. It gets you to the same place, but it leads to many, many other issues that you have to deal with. So if in this commercial building that I'm in right now, the lights that are on, when I turn that light on, the building is using energy, right? It's not directly emitting carbon. That carbon is being emitted at the power plant, supplying the electricity, which could be 5 miles away, it could be 100 miles away. And when it comes to electricity, building owners don't exactly control carbon. They have no ownership over that power plant. Yeah. They control what happens in their building. And so what we've been working hard at Urban Green is to say, okay, it is what it is. I mean, we tried to have an energy efficiency law. We have a carbon law now. Okay, how do we make it work? And we've been working very hard with a lot of different strategies and programs and ideas for how we can improve what we have to make the carbon law work. Because look at, the last thing that we need is some trophy law that we can all feel good about. But if it actually doesn't work, then we don't get the carbon reduction. And we need the carbon reduction.
I was going to ask about, you make a great point about the trophy law. I was thinking about something related, which is the LEED standard, right? Every building, commercial building, residential building worth its salt has some sort of LEED, gold, platinum, et cetera on there. Is there an element of tokenism with some of these standards that happen?
There's a good example of the difference between energy efficiency and a carbon cap like we have. We have many LEED platinum buildings in New York City that will never, ever, ever comply with the law. Now, they use energy super efficiently, but if they have 15,000 people working in the building, all using energy very efficiently, you can't get around the fact that the building as a whole just uses a lot of energy.
Right. So
there's a disincentive for density that we need to find a way to fix. Density should be your friend for sustainability. Right. Under Local Law 97, it's not, because we're just dealing with a straight carbon cap. It's easy to understand and it's easy to calculate, but it's a pretty blunt instrument that's blind to what's going on inside the building. And so these are the issues that we're thinking through about how we can improve the law so that more buildings can have a pathway to compliance so that we actually get the carbon reduction that we need. When the law was first proposed, there were 3 caps based on 3 building categories. We got that expanded to 10. Point is, commercial offices have 1 cap. That's it. Doesn't matter what goes on in the office. So if you have a building that has high density, that has data centers, and has trading floors, it is held to the same carbon standard as the building next door, which could be law offices and insurance headquarters. Yep. I love them too, but typically bigger office spaces, conference rooms, not operating 24/7. Those 2 buildings are held accountable to the same standard, recognizing that they're not doing the same thing. Right. And so there is societal value for what's happening in the building using carbon. It has data centers that's keeping the internet alive. It's keeping banking going. I mean, these are things that we need, right? And so we have to find a way for those buildings to comply.
How much of the problem is really a matter of adaptation and implementation? And how much of it is development of new technologies, thinking and investing in new tech?
Energy efficiency is always your first, best, and last friend. And so you have to find ways to boost the energy efficiency of buildings. It's hard work. You need, good people, trained people to understand it. But I haven't found a building yet anywhere in the world that's operating 100% efficiently. There's always something that can be done. And so you need to look at that first. When you do that, you invest in yourself as a building, right? So if you upgrade the efficiency of your building, you're improving the asset by investing in yourself, and you're also lowering your costs. So that's always the first best case. Technology will be our friend. It always is. You can view it in decade chunks, like the march of technology and how it's helped us. By the way, it will be our friend not only for buildings, but how we solve climate change overall.
Right.
The big technology breakthroughs we need are in understanding how the building operates and the building management systems and the data. The more data you have and the more granular data you have, the better you can operate the building. And we need better controls in buildings. The pandemic has laid bare some interesting facts about buildings where we thought we knew everything about commercial office buildings when suddenly we found new things out. So in Manhattan today, we're still operating at about 10% occupancy, meaning 90% of the buildings are vacant. Energy reduction in those buildings has only gone down 30%. So 90% of the people have left. Only 30% of the energy has gone by. Or said a different way, there's a 70% base load for empty buildings.
Right.
So it's like, what's going on? Like, how is that even possible? And so we did a great program on this with several owners and engineers to kind of look into what's going on. Well, we're learning new things. We're learning things like if you don't have a cloud-based system, and you work from home, all your computers are on in your office because they're connected to a server.
Right.
And we talked to one office that said that their desk energy load, because they'd actually metered everything where I am right now. So like a lot of buildings, there's either one person in the office or two people in the office. And in many buildings, there isn't the ability to split the ventilation or air conditioning system. So if you go into you could have an office that's the size of the floor.
Yeah.
Somebody goes in, what's going to happen? You're going to social distance. Right? So somebody goes somewhere, somebody goes someplace else. Pretty soon you're cooling and heating the whole space.
How are you thinking in your current role about how to inform, startups, developers themselves about investing in technology?
My message to them is bring it on. We did an analysis exactly for this reason to say what would happen to the retrofit market in New York City if every building owner chose energy efficiency as its compliance path to local law 97. What that data shows is that we would create a $20 billion market for energy retrofits by 2030. It would be the largest retrofit market in the United States. And based on my global experience, I think it'll be the largest retrofit market in the world. Now, the reason why we put that number out there is I'm convinced there's technologies in people's basements and garages with entrepreneurs who are just trying to find a market. Here is the market. It is a $20 billion market to access and serve. Bring us your best technology with your best value proposition because there's going to be an appetite for thinking differently because of local law 97.
One of the most exciting things, and typically real estate operators in our experience don't really change how they operate until there's a financial incentive to do so. And one of the most interesting developments that we've seen is this sort of the capital markets are now waking up to sustainability.
I think they're starting. I think there's a lot farther we can go. I think risk should be built into payback. That $3 trillion of assets that are at risk to climate change We have to, when we actually reduce carbon emissions, that should be part of the payback, that we're reducing that risk.
Could you see a time where a bank or a major lender says, hey, you know what, your building isn't green enough for this, you're going to get dinged in a sense that your rate's going to be higher than the other guy's rate? Clearly,
we see it in asset valuation, right? So when a green building is sold, it's commanding a higher premium at time of sale. Or said differently, maybe there's just a brown discount for the buildings that aren't. But the greatest place we see this playing out globally is with pension funds. Mm-hmm. Pension funds aren't quite well understood in the sense that they are the invisible hand moving the sustainability real estate market. In a previous life, I was following this and met with Previ, Brazil's largest pension fund. Mm-hmm. At the time I met with them, they had just declared that when they make real estate investments, they would only invest in certified green buildings. I sat down with them and wanted to understand why. And I was completely blown away because I was thinking they were going to say, well, we have social pressures, we have ESG goals. It has nothing to do with that. They were trying to future-proof their portfolio. What they say is, when we invest in real estate, we need to make a profit because we're funding pensions. Like, this isn't speculation. And so as we, the pension managers, look 10 years out, we're going to hold the property for about 10 years and then we're going to sell it. When we look 10 years out, we don't think the property will hold its value unless it's a certified green building. So they were future-proofing the investments in their portfolio. That's what changed everything in the green building market.
That's fascinating because even if you look at ownership, right, the nominal owner in New York City real estate might be a family, might be a local developer, et cetera. But so much of the money, whether it's a partial stake or a controlling stake, is a CPP, is a CalPERS, a CalSTRS, et cetera. So that's fascinating that they're sort of exerting that pressure, and then the developer or the face of that building has no choice but to go along. So that momentum, I guess, there is now a triple threat, right? There's the legislative pressure, there's the capital markets pressure, and there's the pressure from the occupiers. And I think that confluence hasn't really existed before to this level, right? I think that makes it so interesting. John, you might hear this argument when you're talking about this stuff. Like, New York City's in a pretty tough fiscal position right now. Hey, look, we have a lot of things to think about. We're in an affordable housing crisis. We have this crisis. These are our budgets. They don't look very good. They're all red. How can we invest in green initiatives now? How can we invest in sustainability now? Is this not a tomorrow problem? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I'm completely sympathetic to the financial crisis that we're in across the board. At the same time, I'm not willing to accept that we have to sacrifice health for climate or climate for health. And I would actually throw equity into the equation too. For too long, we have been presented false choices where you can either have climate, but you can't have health and equity, or you can have health, but you can't have equity and climate. And those days have to be over. We have to find a way to optimize our decisions, particularly in real estate, for climate, health, and equity, and do all three together at the same time.
When you talk about equity, in this case, you're talking about racial equity, social...
I'll give you a great example, and it's one we haven't even talked about yet. The single largest source of carbon emissions in New York City comes from burning fossil fuels at the building for heat and hot water. So 40% of all carbon emissions in New York City come from burning fossil fuels, oil or natural gas, at buildings for heat and hot water. For comparison, all transportation combined, subways, buses, trains, cars, trucks, are 28%. So this is 40% of our problem. It's the biggest and most difficult problem that we have in New York City from a climate change standpoint, from my perspective. Because what we're talking about doing is we have to change in multifamily, for example, steam heat, and convert that to an electrical heating source that you plug into a grid that becomes renewable over time. Heat pumps are a common technology today to do We talk about that because that's 40% of the climate emissions. And usually the story stops there. But guess what? You're burning a fossil fuel in the basement of a multifamily building. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's releasing CO2, which is the climate issue we've been talking about, but it's also releasing PM 2.5, nitrous oxide, SOx. It's releasing health pollutants, particularly that impact lung health. Mm. So we need to find a way to transition those sources of fuel to something renewable, not only for the climate, but to improve local air quality in many of our neighborhoods across New York. That's where the equity and the health issue all come together. You know, how do buildings become solutions to some of these issues? When you do electrification, for example, and you replace those steam radiators with a heat pump, the heat pump keeps you nice and warm in the winter. But guess what? The heat pump also cools. That's what heat pumps do. They cool and they heat. So now all of a sudden, you've provided social access to cooling during heat waves, which has been a growing issue in New York. And so you can see how you can start, if you think differently, how you can start to optimize for climate, health, and equity together in a way that we've either tried to do it separately, and when you try to do it separately, you compromise one for the other.
But it's not even a moral standpoint. It's a financial decision, right? And I think the more you can take altruism out of this debate, the more you can take like save the planet out of this debate and make it a financial imperative, then you're probably going to see much more buy-in from the industry. And I think that's fascinating, right? Shifting it from something that the lefties would care about or the advocates would care about to something that the business community cares about.
That's what's carried the green building movement in the United States for the first 20 years. Mm-hmm. It was about financial value and the reason to do it. So you either did it because your investor was telling you to do it, you did it because you got better occupancy, or you knew you were going to get a better sale price on the building, or you did it because your tenants were asking for it, right? So the Fortune 500 helped to transform the real estate market just in their real estate policies that would say, if we're going to lease a building or lease an office, it needs to be to some global green building standard, typically LEED. So all of a sudden, okay, if you want to attract Fortune 500 clients, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you're going to build LEED, which is why LEED took off all around the world, in China, in the Middle East, was to attract those corporate clients because of those policies. So that served us really well and helped with market transformation. We just need to go further and faster because the climate change has become worse. And that's why you see Local Law 97 and efforts like that starting to pick up where the market forces got us to understand that we need to push a little harder to get a little further because that's what the climate demands.
We started this discussion talking about the skyline. When you look at the skyline as a real estate nut, you immediately start thinking of air rights as well. That's another thing that if you know the business well enough, you're like, oh yeah, they just did this deal. There was this air rights transfer. I bring that up because one of your policies that you're putting forward is fascinating to me, which is this idea of carbon trading, which is carbon credits become a commodity that you can buy and sell.
So let's go back to the example that we've been talking about the building that is super energy efficient, but still can't comply with Local Law 97, because maybe it has 15,000 people that work in the building. Maybe it has a data center.
Let's say Palantir is a tenant, so big data processes and stuff.
Right. So the building can't comply.
Okay.
What's that building to do? Right. So there's very few choices on the table right now. They could buy renewable power that comes into New York City, but that power is not available yet. We hope it'll be there. We hope this is a big market signal to get that renewable power into New York City. So if they could do that, if that's not available, they're kind of left with paying a fine, which a fine is a failure. A fine is a waste. It's a lose-lose situation because we don't get the carbon reduction, right? So instead of paying a fine, doesn't it make sense for the building owner that can't comply for legitimate reasons to pay somebody else to go below their cap? Because maybe the building next door is in a different capital cycle. Maybe they're replacing all the windows in the building, or maybe they're replacing their entire chiller plant. And rational investment will say, I'm going to invest to meet my cap. Well, what if there's all this carbon below here that you could still keep going? There's no financial incentive to do that, right? Unless somebody else is going to pay you to do it. So you could pay to go lower. And that's the essence of how carbon trading could work. Now, back to our other conversation about equity. I actually think if we're going to create a new currency and a new capital market, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to point it in a direction for good. Mm-hmm. So we could provide incentives through the design of this program to drive those investments into environmental justice communities and low to moderate income communities.
Any concerns about gaming that market so that it's not really moving the needle on climate change as much as it just becomes another way to make money?
Well, I mean, look, you have to be concerned about that in anything you do. I'm confident that we can design a system that is robust and delivers what we need. First of all, the way I would do it is you don't trade a credit until you generate a credit, mm-hmm. right? And so nobody does nothing unless you reduce carbon somewhere. Now I have a token. I have my carbon token, right? So you've guaranteed that it's already happened. Now you're just going to trade it to somebody who can't. So you have to verify that, and there are ways to do it. But look, I'm across the street from the world's most sophisticated trading house that there is, right? This is what New York does. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think we should be intimidated by that.
Would you consider sort of like a global trading market at some point? So that because the climate change is a local problem in one sense, real estate is local, but climate change is by definition a global problem as well.
Yeah, I don't think we would ever get to the point where, if you own a building in New York, you could trade with a building in London. Mm-hmm. I think we could get to a point where if you own a building in New York, you could trade with a building in Newark. Okay. There's no reason why you can't do it across the river. Even that would be a Herculean task. But the point of why we think trading is an answer here is, look, it's a breakthrough city level policy tool. Cap and trade is not new, right? But what we have is cap with no trade with Local Law 97, right? Mm-hmm. We think that can actually unlock carbon savings around the world. And why we're doing it is, I told you that the retrofit market could be $20 billion. What that means in the opposite way, it's going to cost $20 billion to make Local Law 97 work, to comply with the law, right? Look, I'm absolutely convinced we are going to be successful with this law. We're going to find ways for it to work. We're going to do our part. We're the largest city in the country. We're going to reduce our emissions like we said we would. But guess what? After we do all that and we spend the $20 billion, if no other city acts, New York Harbor still floods because climate change is a global problem. Yep. So we have a responsibility to do it, but also to do it in a way that other cities can follow. And I think that's why we're spending so much time on carbon trading, because it's a new tool that other cities can use.